20th year of the Da Vinci Code. So that's really great for you to come and be here with us again. So welcome, Clive and Lynn. Fantastic.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Neil, very much for inviting us, even if it is the wrong sort of north. You probably tell I'm a Yorkshire lass, so it's a bit, you have to be extra nice to me to make me feel comfortable. Right, so, unbelievably, it's 20 years since the whole Da Vinci Code phenomenon. But even more importantly to us, it's 25 years since our book, The Templar Revelation, came out. And believe me, the two are not unconnected, to put it mildly. And the longevity of both books, because as Neil said, all our books are still in print after all this time, I have 3 decades. But the longevity of Dan Brown's book, in many ways, and ours, has had, though we say so ourselves, a massive effect, which is massive in its implications, not just for us personally, but for a great many people. They might not know it, but it's true. In the intervening years, there's become another phenomenon surrounding the Da Vinci Code, and that is that it's become fashionable to publicly pour scorn on it. It's badly written, it's a terrible story, it's full of holes, it's full of errors, it's trashy, it's, what can you expect from a mere airport thriller, come on. And even people who once couldn't get enough of it feel they have to be ashamed of even having read the Da Vinci Code. But on the whole, if you cast your mind back that far, that was emphatically not how it was received at the time, of course. After it burst onto the public arena, it was everywhere. People were even reading it walking down the street. I saw the classic thing, somebody walking into a lamppost because they were reading the Da Vinci Code. I mean, it was a sensation, a phenomenon, a publishing phenomenon. It was electrifying, it was galvanizing. And suddenly, people were talking. And when I say people, millions upon millions upon millions worldwide were suddenly talking about traditional Christianity, but not just talking about it. Because of an airport thriller, there has to be the hand of the cosmic joker in there somewhere, because of a mere airport thriller, millions of people were actively questioning Christianity as an organized religion. And it was a great cultural shift. It was almost a new paradigm in a way. And it has an ongoing legacy. As I say, people might not even recognize it. They might be part of the growing number who feel free to diss the Da Vinci Code, even though they loved it at the time. But in their heads, part of their being now, part of their psyche, will have changed because of the Da Vinci Code, because it raised a lot of questions, which is its legacy, because those questions are ongoing. And it's those questions now embodied in our consciousness. I mean, questions such as, what's all this about Jesus and Mary Magdalene being an item? Are these Gnostic gospel things real? Whatever happened to this sacred feminine? But the biggest one, has the church been lying to us for 2,000 years? So no, we're not ashamed of being so closely associated with the Da Vinci Code. And as I say, closely associated is putting it rather mildly. And as you probably know, we pass up no opportunities to bang on about our relationship with the Da Vinci Code, because without us, there would have been no Da Vinci Code, either the book or the movie. And if you think that's an exaggeration, Dan Brown, under oath in London's High Court, said, "I got all I needed for the big idea from the Templar Revelation." And Hugh Rifkin in the Times called us Dan Brown's mentors. And frankly, if you were us, you'd bang on it as well, bang on about it as well, wouldn't you? I mean, come on, So this is how it all started. In early 2003, we were wondering, this is how it all started for us, that is. We were wondering what our next book should be when a package arrived from a friend in the States. I wonder what it could contain, saying, you may find some of this familiar. It was, of course, the Da Vinci Code. And the title in itself was a bit amazing to us, a bit provocative in a sense, because the first chapter of our book, Templar Revelation, is The Secret Code of Leonardo da Vinci, our 1997 book. And not surprisingly, we were intrigued, to say the least, and recognized that this could be significant for us. How right we were.
Thank you. Yes, well, as Lynn said, Da Vinci Code introduced a lot of people who wouldn't usually have got interested in certain subjects to all these new ideas. So we have to thank Dan Brown for that. I mean, it introduced a lot of ideas. Some of those ideas we agree with, some of them we very much do. But nevertheless, it introduced a whole new audience to this kind of subject and to our kind of book. So we got this package from an American friend because the book was out in the States. It hadn't come out over here yet. And we started to read it. The thing people always said about the Da Vinci Code was, it's a page-turner. And it certainly was for us, but what kept us turning the pages was a very different reason to most readers. Because, from that title, Da Vinci Code, it looked like it was based on Templar Revelation, which begins with us finding a secret code in Leonardo da Vinci's paintings. But then you start to read it, and the very first thing you see is that there's a preface page. I'm assuming most people here have read it at some point. It's headed Fact, this page, and it talks about this secret society, the Priory of Zion, a real secret society founded in 1099, whose parchments were discovered in the French National Library. They're actually typewritten papers, but anyway. And that is really from another book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, which I'm sure needs no introduction to you. Now, there is a connection between Holy Blood, Holy Grail and Templar Revelation, because Leonardo da Vinci is supposed to have been one of the Priory of Zion's Grand Masters, but Bagent, Lee and Lincoln don't really say very much about him or explore why he's on the list of Grand Masters. They only really give a couple of paragraphs to him, whereas in our books we do say a lot. So for us, it was, which way is this going to go? Is it Templar Revelation? Is it Holy Blood, Holy Grail? There was only one way to find out, and that was to read the book. So that's why we were turning the pages. And it all begins, well, the Da Vinci Code obviously begins in the Louvre in Paris, with all these codes hidden in Leonardo's paintings. Now that's from us. There's nothing about that in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It's where Templar Revelation starts, where our chapter, The Secret Code of Leonardo da Vinci, that's what that's about. Dan Brown writes that Leonardo, quotes, incorporated in many of his Christian paintings symbolism that was anything but Christian, tributes to his own beliefs and a subtle thumbing of his nose at the church. Now that certainly is us. That's our take on Leonardo. Dan Brown also has Leonardo being really into the sacred feminine and the goddess, which is a big part of our book. It's not a big part of Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. They pretty much ignore the feminine, sacred or otherwise. As most people know, this Holy Blood, Holy Grail's big theory was about the bloodline formed from the children of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But to them, Mary Magdalene's only really important because she was Jesus' wife and the mother of his children. There's nothing, she's not important in her own right. Whereas in our book, she certainly is. And then there's what Dan Brown says about Leonardo's painting The Virgin of the Rocks, which is one of the key moments in our research that kind of brought things together and made us realise, in a way, what the mystery was all about. Virgin of the Rocks, this is the version that's in the Louvre. Then we'll go into it more later on. But very briefly, just to explain what the painting's about, it was Leonardo was commissioned to paint this. It wasn't his own idea. And he was commissioned to depict this scene, which was actually invented. It's not from the Bible. It's one that was invented to overcome a rather obvious anomaly or problem in the Gospels, which is that it all begins when Jesus, his mission begins, when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. And there's a couple of very obvious questions, which is, well, why did he need to be baptized in the first place? The other one is that obviously the person who officiates in a ritual like baptism, at least at that moment, has authority over the person being baptized. And to overcome this, the church invented very early on this little tale, this episode, which is that actually they had already met when they were both babies. And on that occasion, the baby Jesus blessed baby John and gave him permission and the authority to baptize him when they were grown up. So that's apparently what we see, which is baby Jesus blessing baby John, who is kneeling in submission. But if you look at it, the two children seem to be with their wrong protectors. Baby John is with the Virgin Mary, and the other figure there, that's the Archangel Uriel, who was traditionally John the Baptist's protector. Which is a little bit odd, but if you look at the two children, the two infants, they are actually pretty much identical, which suggests that Leonardo was deliberately confusing their identity. And the bottom line of it is that we think the children are with their correct protectors. In other words, they're the wrong way round for this story, or for the church's story. They're with their right protectors. It is actually baby John that's blessing Jesus, who is kneeling in submission. A couple of clues in there. The one that's apparently baby Jesus is dipping his hand in a pool of water, which suggests baptism. But the real clue for us is the positioning of Mary's hand and Uriel's finger, which suggests the shape between them suggests that there is like an invisible head above that baby, kind of labelling it as John the Baptist, who of course was beheaded. Anyway, we just want to compare what we say in Templar Revelation to what is said in the Da Vinci Code. And I shall quote from us, first of all. This is Templar Revelation. Mary's hand is stretched out above the head of, quotes Jesus, in what seems to be a gesture of downright hostility. And this is what a recent biographer of Leonardo describes as, quote, reminiscent of an eagle's talons, end quote. What if the child with Mary is Jesus and the youngster with Uriel is John? In this case, it's John blessing Jesus with the latter submitting to his authority, and Mary protecting her son is casting a threatening hand high above the head of baby John. Mary's outstretched fingers are meant to look as if they were placed on the crown of an invisible head, while Uriel's pointing finger cuts across the space precisely where the neck would be. And this is from the Da Vinci Code. Oddly, though, rather than the usual Jesus blessing John scenario, it was baby John who was blessing Jesus, and Jesus was submitting to his authority. More troubling still, Mary was holding one hand high above the head of infant John and making a decidedly threatening gesture, her fingers looking like eagle's talons, gripping an invisible head. Finally, the most obvious and frightening image, just below Mary's curled fingers, Uriel was making a cutting gesture with his hand, as if slicing the neck of an invisible head, gripped by Mary's claw-like hand. I think they're pretty similar. Or you can see they're pretty similar. This is what actually refers to one of our book's main themes, which is the Johannite heresy, which we'll come back to. So we're reading this and thinking, well, we're about 140 pages into the book now, so we think, we know where this is going. But then a fair way further on from that, after a lot of kind of running around and chasing him through the streets of Paris and so on, suddenly the plot veers off into the theory in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which was about the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, protected by the Priory of Zion and all that. And then it pretty much sticks with that for the rest of the book. So what happened? Why did it start off Templar Revelation and then suddenly go Holy Blood, Holy Grail? Well, we found out, and we also found out just how much of an inspiration Templar Revelation had been, thanks to, you probably remember, back in 2006 there was a case taken out in the High Court where two of the authors of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, Michael Bagent and Richard Lee, sued the UK publisher of the Da Vinci Code for infringement of copyright. Very unwisely, because they lost spectacularly twice, because they appealed the decision and lost again. It was only those two. Henry Lincoln, the third author, didn't get involved. He described it as, to us, when we talked about it, he said it was just sheer greed on the part of his two co-authors. But we went every day to the court, the High Court in London, because we couldn't not. We actually wanted to see what exactly Bagent and Lee's case was, because we couldn't actually see that they had one. You know, this was... in fact, Bagent and Lee's lawyers asked us to appear as witnesses on their behalf, but we politely declined, partly because we didn't have a problem with a novelist using a non-fiction book as a research source. The other weird thing about Bagent and Lee's case is they were actually suing their own publisher, because it was the same publisher of the Da Vinci Code, Random House, was also the publisher of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and they were also the publishers of Templar Revelation. So we didn't want to testify against our own publisher. But we did go to the court every day. So we wanted to see exactly what the case was, and we just wanted to watch this drama play out. Not denying it was also a media opportunity, because this was at the height of Da Vinci Code mania. It was a month or something before the movie came out, so you know, the media were all over this. And we got to meet Dan Brown there. In fact, he recognised and introduced himself to us rather than the other way round. But the main thing for us that came out of the case was that although it was the publisher that was actually being sued, Dan Brown obviously had to be their main witness for the defence, and he had to go through the whole process of how he conceived, developed and wrote the Da Vinci Code. And where the idea, well, as Lynn said, the big idea, as he called it, came from, he'd written Angels and Demons. He wanted to write another story about Robert Langdon that had to be set in the art world, and he said he was searching for the big idea. He was doing a book signing in New England, I think, in a bookshop, and while he was in the shop he saw a copy of Templar Revelation, thought that sounds interesting, bought a copy, and as he put it, that gave him the big idea. And then when he started to actually write the book, in the first 200 pages that he delivered to his American publisher, there's absolutely nothing from Holy Blood, Holy Grail in it. But then after that 200 pages, that's when he read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and he literally changed the plot. In fact, the plot of the Da Vinci Code was originally going to be very different. It was actually going to be based on our very first book that we'd written before Templar Revelation, which was about Leonardo da Vinci and his faking of the Turin Shroud. and the climax was going to be set in Turin, not in London. And that explains this weird setup at the beginning about Leonardo's paintings and the Johannite theme, with the Virgin of the Rocks and so on. But then he read Holy Blood, Holy Grail and decided to change the plot. He also decided to change the name of one of the characters, because the villain in the Vinci Code, Sir Lee Teabing, who is based on Richard Lee, an anagram of Bagent, he was originally, that character was originally going to be called Prince. So I could have ended up being played by Ian McKellen, but it didn't happen. And obviously the other side, the claimants, they wanted to show that in fact that wasn't true, that Dan Brown had actually had and read Holy Blood, Holy Grail before those 200 pages, right from the beginning, and that's what really inspired him. And the judge in the trial actually asked Dan Brown when he was in the witness box, he said that in our book, we describe Holy Blood, Holy Grail as essential reading for anyone interested in the mystery. So he said, well, why did it take you so long in that case? And Dan Brown's answer, under oath, was, I would not have been eager to pick up a book this thick about specifics when Templar Revelation so beautifully outlines the points I needed. So when we say we inspired the Da Vinci Code, yes, the parts about Da Vinci and his code we inspired, but even the parts of his book that we don't go along with, like the Holy Bloodline idea and so on, even those he found out about from reading our book. He found out some of his other main sources, like Margaret Starbird's books about Mary Magdalene, from reading our book. So it kind of gave in the entry to all the things that he put into Da Vinci Code. If he hadn't picked that book up off the shelf in that bookstore, none of it would have happened. But anyway, from that point on, Da Vinci Code's plot is based on the theory in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which makes what he said about Virgin of the Rocks at the beginning really confusing to many readers. And this shift from our book to Holy Blood, Holy Grail happens in the big exposition scene in the middle of the book, what was described during the court case as the Teabing lectures. And this is when Robert Langdon and Lee Teabing fill Sophie Neveu in on what's really behind it all. So Jesus and Mary Magdalene being married, their children forming a bloodline that was protected by the Priory of Zion, and so on. And during that exposition scene, which is set in Sir Lee Teabing's library, in chapter 60, which somehow we indelibly printed on our mind, Dan Brown uses that as a way of naming the books that he'd based his story on, because they're on the bookshelves in Sir Lee Teabing's library. And the first one that's named is Templar Revelation. Then there's Margaret Starbird's books, and then, last but not least, is Holy Blood, Holy Grail. But Da Vinci Code's plot doesn't entirely drop Templar Revelation. It doesn't chuck us out and then go with Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The big difference is between Holy Blood, Holy Grail and the Da Vinci Code. One of the reasons Bagent and Lee lost their case, in fact, is the role of Mary Magdalene. Because as I said earlier, in their book, Mary Magdalene is only really important because she's Jesus' wife and the mother of his children. So their emphasis is on it being Jesus' bloodline. In Da Vinci Code, the emphasis is very much on her, even more so than Jesus. The quest that it's all about is actually to find her hidden tomb. She's also a representative of the sacred feminine of the goddess. So they're very different to Holy Blood, Holy Grail, but very similar to ours. And in fact, so Da Vinci Code turns into a kind of hybrid of the Holy Blood, Holy Grail version, Jesus' wife and mother, and our version of Mary Magdalene, in which she has a big place in his movement in her own right. And she has her own right R-I-T-E. And that's revealed by the final big nod in Templar Revelation in the Teebing lectures, which I will now hand back to Lynn to explain.
I was enjoying that, just sitting there. And now I've got to work again. Right, so can we have the Last Supper, please? Right, this is one of the most famous paintings in the world, of course. And if you cast your mind back to the Da Vinci Code, which is a very long time ago now, of course, if you remember the whole business of the character sitting on Jesus' right, leaning away from him, which is supposed to be, according to the New Testament, the young St. John. But one day, your friend Lynn woke up one morning. I was in Glastonbury. We were in Glastonbury, actually, and I just thought, it's a woman. It's a woman sitting next to Jesus. And then we went all around Glastonbury trying to find a picture so I could point out, and we found a picture about this big. And I was going, no. But anyway, eventually we saw a decent-sized picture, and that started the whole thing of that's a woman and it's a giant M shape, which it is, and all sorts of other things in the painting that we noticed. Well, for a start, the second character along from the right, bent down, quite a lot of art historians agree that that's actually Leonardo himself. Notice he's got his back to Jesus. That's not a coincidence. And also, if you remember that the whole thing of the Last Supper, it's so that he can be betrayed, but also it's to instigate the sacrament, the wine representing his blood and the bread representing his broken body. But if you look on the table, there's hardly any wine. There's certainly no big chalice in front of Jesus, and very, very little broken bread. So make of that what you will, but it's certainly not a standard Christian representation. But Mary Magdalene, as that's obviously who the woman is, gets more interesting the more you look at her, because she and Jesus are wearing mirror image clothes, for a start. And also there's this curious thing which Leonardo probably wouldn't have known the phrase, but he was using visually, he was putting the phrase into our minds. They're joined at the hip. She's leaning away, but they're still joined at the hip. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, surely that's about them being man and wife, and the bloodline they founded. Well, no, not to us, as Clive said. This is one of the things, admittedly a pretty big one, that Dan Brown did not take from us. We really do not go into the whole bloodline business. And if you want to know why, we can talk about it one-to-one, but, we don't. But how did we actually get into Leonardo to start with? Well, first of all, Clive mentioned it, our first book, Turin's Shroud. The first edition was rather coyly subtitled In Whose Image, and subsequent editions, actually, who cares, tell them. It says How Leonardo da Vinci Fooled History. And it's updated. The last one was 2006. It was 2012. And there's more evidence that we've accrued over the years, including one staggering smoking gun, a visual thing to link Leonardo with the Shroud of Turin. Now, I'm going to tell you in brief our conclusions of that book. And in brief, they sound completely bonkers. Completely bonkers. But as I say, we've got a huge amount of evidence for what we say. Okay, this is it. We say he did it. Leonardo faked the so-called holy relic. It's a photograph, and it's a selfie. Told you it sounded bonkers. It's partly a selfie. It's not all a selfie. We were the first people ever to reproduce hands-on all the so-called miraculous characteristics of the Shroud, and we persuaded some quite big names, I have to say, to help us on our way with it. For example, Sir David Frost pitched the story to the BBC himself, and then his production company did our first documentary for them. And we did another documentary. And I must say, although Leonardo posed as Christ, he wasn't the Messiah. But what was he? A very naughty boy. We'll see that at the end. And when I say see it, we will see it. Well, anyway, the thing about the Last Supper is, Clive was saying, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Mary Magdalene was just a kind of adjunct to Jesus. She was only important because of her relationship with him. But Leonardo really seemed to know more about that. He had another insight, if you like. There were lots of underground heresies focused on her, including the Cathars. She stars, as you might know, and that's really, really big word, but it's true. She's the star of the Gnostic Gospels, the forbidden Gospels that came to light mostly in 1945, such as the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, not written by her, sadly, but was discovered about a century before in fragments. But the thing that the Gnostic Gospels have in common, which is absolutely missing from the New Testament, is that, as I say, Mary is the star. I mean, nominally, obviously, Jesus is the star, but Mary actually is the star. She's feisty, energetic, maybe a bit bossy and maybe a bit controlling. Sorry, but she is. There's also some very clear references to her relationship with Jesus. For example, the male disciples go to Jesus and say, Lord, why do you love her more than you love all of us? I mean, you think, come on, boys, why do you think, And in fact, Jesus repeats it back to them. He says, why do I love her more than I love all of you? You can hear it in his voice, And then they pursue this line. They say to him, why are you always kissing her on the mouth? But yes, and in fact, the actual fragment of the parchment, it says, why are you always kissing her on the, because that bit's missing. Over the years, there have been some attempts to explain that away by traditionalists when faced with the awkward fact of the Gnostic Gospels. I mean, for example, they say, Jesus was obviously pecking her on the cheek, was it not? But I mean, it actually outraged wherever he kissed her, absolutely outraged the male disciples. If it was a peck on the cheek, probably wouldn't. But I mean, it could be, yes, that he kissed her on the lips, because it seemed to be very publicly affectionate, which was scandalous. But he could have kissed her on the hand. That would have been scandalous too, because that would have shown so much respect as to be almost subservience. We don't know where he kissed her, but it certainly wasn't a mere peck on the cheek. Our conclusions are, not only was she Jesus' lover, she was his priestess as well, and that's a very big statement. There's evidence that they shared spiritual secrets that he did not share with the male disciples, the famous 12. Despite what we are led to believe, if you like, she was his inner circle, not them. And there's one bit that in the Gnostic Gospels where it gives away her character rather, but also it gives away the state of play within the mission, within Jesus' mission, because at one point she says, why don't you tell to Jesus, why don't you tell the others, the thing we were talking about, so that even they might understand it? Ooh. So Mary was, there's a kind of Yoko Ono element to her. She broke up the band a bit, because in the Gnostic Gospels you have the male disciples, particularly Simon Peter, hating her so much they threatened to kill her. So when you hear of the traditionalists saying, the Gnostic Gospels are a bit of fluff that were just made up. Fluff? I mean, they would have made it all sweetness and light on the mission, instead of all, absolute people being at each other's throats. But also, we say that she was a priestess for one amazing thing she did, and it's hidden in plain sight in the New Testament. She's the woman with the spikenard, with the alabaster jar. She's unnamed, but in the context it's very clear it's Mary Magdalene. She insists on anointing Jesus with this incredibly expensive balm, again to the male disciples' bafflement and outrage. And in fact, no doubt they think they were sucking up to their leader and showing how clever they were, because they said, they were, as I said, they were outraged, and they said, she could have sold that ointment, it's so expensive, you know, and given the money to the poor. And they stand there waiting for Jesus to pat them on the head. And he's actually really quite angry with them. He says, the poor you'll always have with you. Me, you've got now. And he says, not in those words, obviously, but he also says, she has anointed my body, prepared my body for the burial. Meaning, she's actually marked me out for my destiny. And he also said, wherever the gospel is preached, her name will be celebrated. Well, pity it isn't, shame on them, because it's not even given in the gospel, let alone celebrated. But what had Mary actually done in her rather quaint anointing? Well, what does Christ mean? The word Christ, Messiah, but it also means anointed one. And there's only one anointing in the New Testament, and it's done by a woman. And it's completely misunderstood. And it's done by Mary. And as Clive said earlier, when you are performing a ritual on somebody like baptism or anointing, at that moment at least, you have to have authority over the person in order to give them the authority. So Mary was really a priestess if she was doing that, and she was. So that's what she's doing in the Last Supper, taking her rightful place both as lover and priestess. But there's another code, as Clive said. I keep wanting to call him Jesus, sorry. As Clive said, different, in Leonardo's artwork, even more heretical and not so nearly well known, of course, which centres, as Clive said, on John the Baptist. And though Dan Brown obviously didn't go into it, we, of course, did in Templar Revelation and in subsequent books. Yes. This is Leonardo's rather strange and unsettling portrait, or painting anyway, of John the Baptist. Like a lot of Leonardo's characters that are not portraits, and some of them that are, its the face is a bit the eyes are very knowing, shall we say. This is not an innocent face. And he's making what we came to call a John gesture, because in Leonardo's work, certainly, wherever it appears, it's either made by John or refers to John. This is the adoration of the Magi, which, as the name suggests, is obviously by Leonardo. As the name suggests, it's the scene where the three kings, or the three magi, turn up and hand over the gold, frankincense and myrrh to Mary and the baby Jesus. And you might think, well, it's all very pretty. It's not. It really, really isn't. Look at the people in the second half of the bottom half of the painting, who are basically the kings and their entourage, handing over the stuff. They're all old, hollow-eyed, zombie-like almost, clawing at Jesus. I mean, I wouldn't want to be worshipped by them, you know, it's really, really not good. But then they're not the only worshippers in the painting. If you look above the Virgin, and that's visually is what it's supposed to be above in both senses, there's a tree going to the top of the painting. And the tree is a carob tree, which is traditionally associated with John the Baptist. And there's a young man, you might not be able to see very clearly, but there's a young man standing right up against the tree on its right, and he's doing that. Although that's the bit that's difficult to make out because of the light and shade, but he's doing that, absolutely up against the trunk of the tree. That's the John the Baptist. The tree represents John the Baptist. And there's other young, gloriously young and sexy and healthy-looking people apparently worshipping the tree. So the people worshipping Jesus are old, decrepit, more than 1 foot in the grave, really quite disgusting. And the young people worshipping, or apparently worshipping, John, the elements of John, are young, healthy, sexy, glowing. And this young man in the bottom right, turning violently away, one might say, from the Holy Family, that's Leonardo. So, and people have suggested, he was too modest to face them. Yeah, right. So this is a very, very Johannite painting. It's incredibly shocking, really, for those who think of all Leonardo's religious paintings as being nothing less and nothing more than religious paintings. Oh, believe me, there's a lot more to see. Just going back to what Clive said about the Virgin of the Rocks, although this is not the last time you'll be seeing this painting, but if you remember the children of the wrong way round, that, again, it's very Johannite. When the children are seen with their correct and expected guardians, so it's Jesus with his mother and John with his traditional protector Uriel, then it's John who is bestowing authority on Jesus, who is kneeling in submission. Very, very Johannite. But was he the only Johannite, Leonardo? I mean, he was a genius, and often they're a bit weird. But it started looking for the roots of this heresy, started us on a big journey. In fact, we discovered Leonardo was just part of an ancient esoteric tradition within the Western esoteric tradition, hidden in plain sight. But nobody before us had put all the pieces together. It's a real thing, and it hovers in the background of the likes of Freemasonry and the Knights Templar, even in some of the early Grail romances. In fact, it's very strong there. And it really does go back to the origins of Christianity, with the relationship of Jesus and John the Baptist and their respective followers. It's all in the book. But anyway, back to that. So that's the background to where we fit in, and what we were saying that wasn't in the Da Vinci Code. But, right, so Da Vinci Code was out, and our sales went up, hurrah, because, chapter 60, there's a list of books for further reading, as it were, and ours is top of the list. There are 4 of them. Ours is top of the list, and, people going, I wonder if there are real books. Oh, Amazon, So we were very chuffed, and doing rather well for a short time. And then came the rather baffling court case that Clive talked about. Indeed, we did get a call from their lawyer asking us to appear as witnesses for them, and we said no, because as Clive said, we had no interest whatsoever in trying to, speak against our own publishers. We weren't, we're not stupid. We politely declined. But there was another reason as well. I mean, we actually didn't agree with their court case. He'd used a lot from us, as you realise. And we thought, it's doing us a lot of good, on the one hand. On the other hand, his is a novel. Ours is non-fiction. He could use non-fiction book as reference, and he has credited us, albeit not by name, but with our book title in his book. So what more do you want? So we didn't agree with their very foolish court case. As Clive said, we were there every day. But to this day, we come across people who say, that was such a travesty, that court case. It was so unfair, so unjust. No, it bloody wasn't. It was one of the most just things you could come across. We were there every day. And it was one of the most cringe-making scenarios you could imagine, sadly. An example. Before the case came to court, the judge was a bit annoyed that it was a bit vague what they were saying. He stole our central themes. And the judge said, well, list your central themes then and sign off each one. So they did, and there was something like 13 of them they claimed Brown had stolen from them. So in court, Mr. Baldwin, QC, for the publishers, said to Michael Bagent in the witness box, he said, well, you know, you recognise these, you still stand by them? Yes. So he took him through every one of them, and not one of them stood up. In fact, there was this, talk about cringe-making, there were at least 2 of these so-called central themes that Dan Brown was allegedly nicked. That Mr. Baldwin said to Michael Bagent, would it surprise you to know, Mr. Bagent, that this isn't even in your own book? There were some that weren't even in the Da Vinci Code. I mean, you know, it was just unbelievable. And Clive said we learnt a lot from the trial about, well, the original plot of the book was going to be about the Shroud and Leonardo. Wonder where he got that from. So it was still us, you know. And then, of course, came the movie. You might recognise some noses there, and there. I was quite alarmed because I couldn't tear my eyes away from his crotch. Yes. So we got the cameos in the movie, which is very nice. And it was a very jolly day, and it was Clive's birthday. How many people do you know that had 3 Oscar winners singing Happy Birthday? So we spent 10 hours with our mate Tom. Yeah, sorry you couldn't be there. Anyway, what had happened, the reason that we got the gig, actually, the cameo things, we had our own Winnebagos, I mean, come on. And the other extras hated us because they didn't know why we were teachers' pet. And I do have to tell you this little anecdote, because when we got settled on the bus, it was a real bus, we got settled on the bus, and Ron Howard, the director, said, Lynn and Clive, he said. And even just knowing our names, all the extras were, oh, you know, and he said, you know, look around you. Does anything strike you as being wrong for a typical London bus? And even though Ron Howard is a delightful man, but there was still the element of, you know, the great hierarchy in Hollywood hierarchy. You don't answer back to a director, you know. And Clive said, yeah, there's something that's missing. And the crew went, oh. He answered back to Ron Howard. And so Ron said, well, Clive, what is that? And Clive said, nobody's reading the Da Vinci Code, which was pretty good. Anyway, we didn't get the gig directly because of Templar Revelation. I mean, underlyingly, of course we did. But the direct thing was, in fact, my Mary Magdalene book, which I'd written a couple of years before, which, by myself, not with Clive, and it's called Mary Magdalene, Christianity's Hidden Goddess. And they wanted to use the book as set dressing. They wanted to feature it on the set. And then, I mean, we didn't really know whether they had or not, but, you know, we were happy to go along. And when we attended the cast and crew premiere in London, this is what we see. There it is, Ian McKellen holding my book. And it's the only book, the real book in the whole movie, apart from Malleus Maleficarum. My book had come out between the Da Vinci Code book and the movie, and the screenwriter, Akiva Goldsman, had taken one of its themes and changed the purpose of the quest to kneel at Mary Magdalene's tomb. In Brown's novel, he'd written, the quest for the Holy Grail is literally the quest to kneel before the bones of Mary Magdalene, a journey to pray at the feet of the outcast one, the lost sacred feminine. But after that, having read my book, screenwriter Goldsman had changed that to worship before her sarcophagus, to kneel before the bones of Mary Magdalene, was to remember all those who were robbed of their power, who were oppressed. My book is dedicated to all those who've suffered at the hands of the church, with the clear implication of those who followed Mary Magdalene and were oppressed for it. And incidentally, my book actually kicked off with my absolutely incandescent fury at what I discovered about the Magdalene laundry scandal, which you presumably know about, mainly in Ireland, elsewhere though. And for over a century, young women, girls, had been literally enslaved by the Catholic Church. And when I say that, it's an educated phrase, because UNICEF has categorized the Magdalene laundries as modern slavery. So they were enslaved, they were cut off from their families for life often, they were starved, tortured, beaten, sexually abused, and buried in mass graves. And the more I heard about it, the more furious I got. And the reason that it attracted my attention was because it was done in Mary Magdalene's name. Okay, it had nothing to do with her. She'd been dead 2,000 years before or so. She couldn't possibly have known anything about it. That's not the point. The point is that to the Catholic Church, she had become the poster girl, the brand name for female shame, for penitence. And you had these girls and these women who, according to the church's morals, according to the nuns, basically, and the priests on the ground in Ireland, there were lots of girls who were shaming the whole community by walking down the road in the company of a Protestant boy, for example. And they would come for them at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, drag them out of bed, take them from their homes into the laundries behind the high walls where the convent was, never to be seen again, mostly. Literally like that. Their names were changed, just like enslaved people's names had been changed. They were told that their parents didn't want anything to do with them, whether that was true or not. And when they wrote letters home, they were taunted because, you haven't had a letter back because your family hate you. But in fact, the nuns never sent the letters. And that's just a tiny sliver of what happened to those young women and girls. Oh, and the whole system stopped, well, mostly, in the 1990s, not because of a great sudden surge of empathy for young women and girls, no, because most people had washing machines. So, yes, I saw suddenly, it all fell into place, that Mary Magdalene has been used by the church to demean women, to smear the good name of women, to smear women's intelligence and power. And I thought, got to write this book. And so I was very pleased when this is an aerial view at one of the last scenes of the Da Vinci Code movie of Tom Hanks kneeling by what they considered to be Mary Magdalene's tomb. And that's taken from my book, my Mary Magdalene book. And it's to honor not just her, but the likes of the Magdalene laundresses. However, I'm going to end on something completely different. In fact, and now for something completely different. Right, now we've been through this, haven't we? Oh no, not that again. Oh, right. No, this is somewhat different, boys and girls. This is a whole shift of mood now. Right, now, Leonardo was commissioned to paint this by a bunch of monks called the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception. Now, it might have given him an idea. Now, the scene that they commissioned him to paint was what Clive outlined, and it doesn't really matter now. But anyway, they only said, basically there's two things. We want you to paint this scene, and it has to fit this frame that we've got, and that's it. The idea of the rocks was entirely Leonardo's idea, and I think you'll see why. I mean, I'm going to point something out to you. It's a bit tricky because I don't have a huge pointer. So you're going to have to, the first thing you have to do is absolutely wipe your mind of any idea of a religious painting. I mean, it's not a religious painting. It's a very, very naughty boy painting. When we first wrote Templar Revelation, I can't believe it now. We said Leonardo never did the equivalent of sticking a red nose on St. Peter. Oh boy, red nose. Right. Virgin Mary. Look immediately above her head. There's two big rocks curving round her head. And going up from them to the skyline is something made of rock. It's even got a vein up the middle of it and a spurt of weeds coming out of the top. Once you see this, you can never unsee it, by the way. So, right, one giant testicle and two giant testicles, and then a giant knob. And that will tell you everything you need to know about Leonardo's attitude to his religious commissions, and particularly his attitude to the Virgin Mary. And considering that it was commissioned by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, as I said, it might have given him his big idea. And you really, really can't unsee it once you've seen it. Believe me, it'll be there in your dreams. Some people's nightmares, admittedly. And it's in there's two versions of this. This is the Louvre version, and there's one in the National Gallery, which also has it, but it's slightly more difficult to see. I wonder what it says about me, that as far as I know, I'm the first person in 500 years to notice it. Okay. Well, yes, so we leave you with Leonardo's biggest surprise and biggest statement for those with eyes to see. Thank you very much.